Well, welcome everybody to our first lecture, or second lecture actually, in our Island Lecture series. And you know, a few little technical glitches. And as I mentioned earlier, you'd think after 2 years of doing this, we'd have it all down pat. But as Megan reminded me, every time you try it, there's something different. So anyway, really glad to have you here. I'm Laurie Brinklow. I am the interim coordinator of the Master of Arts and Island Studies program here at UPEI, as well as the chair of the executive committee of the Institute of Island Studies. And so the Institute of Island Studies is has been at UPEI for over 30 years now, and we are a research, education, public policy institute based at the University in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island on Canada's East Coast. We've been hosting these sorts of lectures for decades, but they've always been in person until recently in the last couple of years. So we have been able to, you know, do that pivot and be able to offer our lectures online, which is really amazing. Because we can, you know, there are pluses that we're taking advantage of. The technology, for instance, to be able to zoom in Shaina from another place, and then she doesn't have to actually be here in Prince Edward Island. These lectures have covered island-related topics from Prince Edward Island as well as other islands. And so we're really happy to have Shaina here. So before I begin, I did turn the record button on, and I think everybody's cameras are off, so that shouldn't be an issue. The cameras, microphones generally are all off, I see as well in my participant list, and please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. So we have a wonderful session in store for you this afternoon, and I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Ebequit in Mi'kmaq, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. As we're gathering today on a virtual platform, it's important to respectfully acknowledge the history, spirituality, culture, and rights of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from coast to coast to coast, who have called this land home since time immemorial, and who continue to experience the ongoing effects of colonialism and systemic racism. So I encourage everyone to consider how we can each in our own way actively honor and uphold our treaty obligations in spirit of true reconciliation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Institute, Megan is going to put our website in the chat, and we are also on social media through Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And we are really happy to be hosting this lecture here this afternoon, because it's afternoon here in Prince Edward Island. Now, to the lecture. We're delighted to have Shaina Sehgal with us today to talk about the Nicobar Islands. It was wonderful to get to know Shaina through her work, and trying to learn a little bit more about the Nicobar Islands. I remember hearing about the Andaman Islanders. It was a book published several years ago, and Andaman and Nicobar always went hand in hand, but I really didn't know very much about them. So a little bit of research, and then today getting to hear from Shaina firsthand what her interest is with her PhD work. So she's an interdisciplinary scholar who studied the social and environmental issues across diverse and challenging terrains across India, which includes the mountains, forests, and of course islands. And she's been studying as a graduate student for the last decade at Ambedkar University, Delhi, India. And I'm sorry I didn't get the pronunciation right. Her PhD in human ecology examined trade, agriculture, development, and governance in the Nicobar Islands using archival research, quantitative data analysis, social network analysis, and ethnographic research. So I will now pass it over to Shaina, who has made a presentation, and after which we will invite you to ask questions. So Shaina.
Thank you so much for such a warm welcome, Laurie, and thank you, Megan, for handling our technical glitches so expertly. I'll just share my screen. And you're right, after this much time, you'd think I'd be better at doing this. Okay, I hope my presentation is visible.
It looks great.
Okay, Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for those joining us from India. I'm Shaina. I've lived and researched environmental and social issues in India, as Laurie mentioned, for a better part of the past decade before calling Canada my home. I'm honored to introduce you all to the Nicobar Islands. It's a small but very important group of islands in the Eastern Indian Ocean. Let me begin by the present. So as Laurie mentioned, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are usually mentioned together because these are a group of islands located 1,200 kilometers off the coast of mainland India. Together with the Andaman group, the Nicobar Islands, they form a union territory of India. There are over 500 islands, islets, and rocks, which make up the Andaman and Nicobar. And they span over 8,250 square kilometers of area in an arc between Myanmar and Indonesia, as you can see in the map. The islands are home to over 435,000 people as per a latest government estimate, a majority of whom came from the Indian subcontinent as political prisoners when India was a British colony, and as migrants in the post-independence period encouraged by the Indian government, and of course, their descendants. The indigenous communities of the islands number under 30,000 people, according to the 2011 census, of which the Nicobaris alone are around 27,000 strong. So of the 6 indigenous communities I've mentioned, the Nicobaris and the Champagne are in the Nicobar Islands, and the other communities reside in the Andaman Islands, and both have a very painful history and engagement with colonial people and the colonization process. The people of the islands today elect one representative to the lower house of parliament, but the islands themselves are without a provincial legislature. They're administered by a lieutenant governor who's appointed by the president of India. Port Blair on the Andaman Islands is the administrative headquarters, the main urban area, the tourist hub, the commercial airport, and port and seaport. The island economy relies on tourism, plantation and fisheries, and public sector employment. The islands also boast of a rich biodiversity and a high degree of endemism in flora and fauna across its tropical rainforest, grassland, mangrove, and coral reef ecosystems. There are over 8,400 species of fauna, of which 846 are endemic to the islands, and about 2,200 varieties of plants, of which 200 are endemic. The Nicobar are actually part of the Sundaland biodiversity hotspot. The islands are in a very seismically active zone. The Nicobars were the first landmass to be struck by the Indian Ocean earthquakes and tsunamis on Boxing Day 2004. Over 3,500 people lost their lives in the Nicobar alone, and there were 300 earthquakes of magnitude 5 and over within the next year, and another 300 of magnitude 4 between 2006 and 2017. But historically, the islands had ports of call along an ancient sea route from West Asia to Southeast Asia. And they were reported by traders and seafarers throughout history. They figure in Ptolemy's maps from the 2nd century, and the earliest written mention I found was in the Chinese Buddhist monk Li Jing's account from 672 Common Era of his travels, which described his barter with the coastal dwelling Nicobarese people. This is a map of his travels from an 1896 translation. In this talk, I will focus on the trading world of the Nicobar Islands between the 18th and 19th centuries, drawing on my PhD research. The Nicobars became noted for their location, the natural harbors, and the residents keen on barter, which attracted interest from a variety of quarters, especially during the 15th to 17th century period, which is widely considered as the Southeast Asian Age of Commerce by the historian Anthony Reid. So there were strong incentives for establishing strategic trade monopolies in this region. Information about the produce and people of the Nicobars elicited interest throughout the medieval period. However, they were often replete with wildly exaggerated and inaccurate accounts, frankly, quite absurd narratives of savagery, cannibalism, and cynocephaly, which persisted in European accounts right up till the early modern period. By this time, however, marine atlases, sailing directories, admiralty charts, and encyclopedias were developed and frequently updated to serve the needs of European trading companies seeking to expand their empire in Southeast Asia in the early 17th century. So structured and durable relations were emerging between corporate trading groups and learned societies. Of course, this knowledge was shaped by local interlocutors and counterparts. And there's so much more to be said about colonial knowledge that emerged in the period. I discussed that in detail in my recent article. In brief, it was incomplete, distorted, but also plural and contradictory. I'm talking about colonial knowledge, not my article. Scholars have encouraged constructively engaging with colonial knowledge. I'm drawing inspiration from the discussions by Roque and Wagner in 2012. And keeping these considerations in mind, which is particularly important to draw out histories of people without a written culture like the Nicobaris and Champagne, and to consider the relationship with environmental resources and conditions. So I keep this in mind while I analyze historical texts, maps, and images from colonial sources for this period, from physical and digital art. So this is a sketch of the central Nicobar Islands of Angkori from the late 1700s. And it is just to give a sense of how the local engagement with the island ecology was on a daily basis in some way. Nicobar homes, for example, as you can see, were built 5 to 6 feet above the ground on bamboo stilts, with the roof made of coconut leaves in an oval shape and a floor made of planks, and split bamboos, according to a description from the period. The home building and repair clearly engaged men for half the year. And in addition to fishing and trading with the neighboring islands, which I described earlier, took up the entire year of their time, while women were chiefly occupied with preparing food and cultivating the ground. And in the case of Chora, also the manufacture of pots. So this preoccupation with sustenance and subsistence by the community likely impeded the expansion of trade to the level of historical eminence. However, the islands had an important role in maritime Asian trade. From letters left by Malay traders with the Nicobaris, Claus argued in the early 1900s that the Asian traders were more prevalent than Europeans in the islands during the 19th century. And this was chiefly for procuring coconuts. We already know items like cane, sea cucumbers, ambergris, coconuts, and bird's nests were important within the Eastern Indian Ocean trade circuit and were not adequately documented in European trade accounts. The presence of Malay and Portuguese words in the Nicobarese vocabulary from the period also suggests that there was a robust participation in trade, which is supported by the elaborate number system in place as well. It is in fact plausible that the Nicobaris may have journeyed across to Indonesia in their canoes, as contemporary ethnographies have demonstrated the existence of a robust seafaring tradition and capabilities such as knowledge of winds, current, and celestial navigation. Excuse me. So the Nicobaris didn't escape the notice of European trading companies expanding in Southeast Asia. The Danish East India Company first attempted to take possession of the islands in 1723. However, several crew members and merchants on the vessel died due to the so-called Nicobaris fever, which was likely malaria. And the vessel returned to the parent colony of Tranquebar, which is on the coast of present-day mainland India, with the large quantities of coconuts and areca nuts. And in the second expedition in 1755, again, they bartered tobacco, canvas cloth, and iron with the Nicobaris in exchange for chicken, pigeons, areca nuts, coconuts, corals, sugar, monkeys, tortoiseshell, sea coconuts, parrots, and other birds. But with the high death toll and the cost of maintaining the colony with frequent supplies from Tranquebar, the Danish reconsidered the existence of an outpost in Nicobar The court permitted the Church of the United Brethren, also known as the Moravian Church, to establish a mission in 1768 on Nangauri. This remained till 1787, but with a high death toll. There was modest trade between the Nicobars and the missionaries during this time, and they collected zoological specimens of serpents, crabs, spiders, and mollusks, and sent them onwards to Tranquebar. So trading in natural history specimens is an interesting side note on its own. It was a very lucrative commercial venture, and the Moravians had acquired a reputation for providing superior quality specimens. But as commercial suppliers to collectors in Asia and Europe, they were rarely credited in the resulting scientific research. The presence of the missionaries and the Danish East India Company's attempts at colonization, however, did not interfere with the trade with other vessels in the islands. It's something that really took place after the British began to regulate trade after colonizing the Nicobars in 1869. Not sure if the slide has loaded. Right. Expeditions under various European flags merged the interests of scientific inquiry with trade and colonization. For instance, the expedition commissioned by the Imperial Austrian government to select Austrian plantations and commercial stations on the far side of the Cape of Good Hope in 1778 arrived in the islands, and subsequently we see the Danish corvette Galathea, which undertook a voyage around the world, began as a naturalist expedition, but became a colonizing one when the captain took formal possession of the Nicobars on behalf of the King of Denmark. I think the map on the left is from the expedition to the Nicobar in March and May of 1845, which visited with the main objective of exploring the southern group of the Nicobars and resumed Danish possession of the islands in the name of King Christian VIII. And here you can see a map of the circumnavigation of the globe by the Austrian Novara expedition in 1857 to 59. If we zoom in, you could see the Nicobar Islands. The chief objective of the expedition was to give a practice on naval affairs and nautical routine, and thereby further the Austrian Navy. But the voyage was also expected to open up new channels for outlets of their natural products and manufactured goods, and to promote the industrial, commercial, and maritime interests of the empire. So to bring it all home, I want to highlight the key takeaways. The Nicobar Islands were a transitional point on the sea lanes of Southeast Asian maritime traffic throughout written history. These islands occupied a strategic position in the Indian Ocean. They had coastlines favorable to sailing along both the southwest monsoon and northeast monsoon winds and currents. They contained sheltered natural harbors and were located at the interstices of the expanding colonial trade monopolies in the Indian Ocean world. The Nicobars attracted interest from European merchants, monarchs, and missionaries. And trade in the islands up till the 18th century was essentially unchanged in that it was chiefly barter of Nicobar's forest, plantation, and marine resources with metal implements and commodities that were impossible to produce with the island's ecological resources alone. Through my presentation, I've tried to show how these islands were a site of sustained contact with the bustling Indian Ocean trade until the early 20th century. And if time permits, I thought I would take a moment to speak about engaging with history in this way, the dreaded so what question. While I've principally looked at text-based evidences, it was informed by learning about material objects, reading oral history, and appreciating islandness from my anthropological fieldwork in the islands for my Ph.D. I got to thinking about this from a conversation with Laurie a few weeks back about engaging with museum collections of artifacts belonging to Indigenous communities in Canada and the important work being done in that regard. And actually, if you indulge me, I will try to connect this to the last lecture, which Ilse spoke about in contemporary art and climate change adaptation. Allow me to make a case for the possibilities offered by historical arts and culture, such as material objects, artifacts, and art from colonial collections. I think they can offer us an insight to the past, but also to the present. And I'll try to share an example, such as the one you see now. On the left is a woman's rasp. It's a coconut grater, which I believe is made of a cane stalk, the petiole of a calamus species. It's presently in the British Museum. It was acquired in 1887 by Edward Horace Mann, who was a colonial administrator and anthropologist who took many photographs of the people and gathered hundreds of objects from the area. So this scrape was about 130 centimeters tall. And, on the right is an image of a woman on Great Nicobar, whose face I've blurred to protect her identity. In 2018, grating coconut to make virgin coconut oil. This is often a communal activity, and women gather and converse in this labor-intensive process of manually grating the coconut kernels on a cane before it is mixed with water and repeatedly pressed through cloth or an oil press to yield coconut milk. So coconuts figure quite prominently in a Nicobar household and day. They're really hard to miss. The kernels are finely chopped by women for feeding pigs and for poultry. They're also used to prepare a variety of foods and virgin coconut oil. And of course, they're a very important item of trade, and the desiccation process to make them compact and less perishable in order to further trade across the boats is a very time-consuming and labor-intensive activity, and therefore becomes a very social enterprise. Another example is the Pandanus tree. I believe there are some ecologists with us in our midst, and forgive me if I've identified the tree wrong, but I thought it was quite remarkable how certain attributes of our food culture evolve, and while others just persist to the present. And the Pandanus is one such example. In 1680s, when the famed, renowned world traveler and explorer William Dampier was on his voyage, he had plans to engage in ambergris trade and settle on the islands, but they didn't materialize. During this time, he observed that he'd procured a loaf of what he called mellory, but most likely was the fruit of a Pandanus tree species. So here on the left is the fruit. It also figures in the diet of the endemic Nicobar long-tailed macaque, and that's a blurred photo because I kept my distance on the right. This fruit intrigued other naturalists during the period. Fontana called it the Nicobar breadfruit tree. He described the palm, which was locally called larum and called mellory in Portuguese. He did so with the great illustrations, such as the one on the left. And long story short, it is the Pandanus larum. The drupes or the fruit continue to be harvested and manually processed into a sweet and sour loaf in the Nicobar Islands in the present day. The byproduct of the fruit comes in handy as a brush, especially as a foot brush, described from this collection at the British Museum, which was acquired in 1887. And it comes in handy in cleaning, especially sand and other debris when coming into the house from the beach. Here is a short clip from when I learned how to prepare kevri or Pandanus bread from a group of delightful ladies in a village on Little Nicobar. You can see the skillful use of the seashell and a light touch to get that first layer of Pandanus paste from the pieces of the boiled Pandanus drupe, which is for feeding livestock. The second cleaning produces another paste, which is processed further using fiber to remove the fiber using thread, and it's used to make the bread loaf. As you can gauge, this is an incredibly labor-intensive process. It's also a social activity, and I was quite frankly very bad at it. Onto the last point I'm trying to make here. Scholars have used a very creative, many creative ways to infer things, studying language and artifacts. And the latter is something I'm really keen on exploring in the future. I'm inspired by the work of Claire Wintle, who looked at the colonial collections on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in her book, Colonial Collecting and Display. Various objects from the islands and belonging to indigenous peoples across the world are found in European museums, including this painted screen you see on the left from Cornwall Island, which the colonial geologist Valentine Ball from the Geological Survey of India at the time got in exchange for rum, cheroots, rupees, and weapons, and rupees in exchange for weapons, images, and utensils, which was acquired in 1873. I've not been able to identify the museum where it ended up, but he describes this piece of art as either the gloom of a bamboo or a spathe of a palm, which has been flattened and framed with split bamboos. It's about 3 feet long, and the figures are painted with vermilion, with their outlines being surrounded with punctures to allow the light to pass through. Suspended from the frame are some young coconuts and fragments of dried hog's flesh. He outlines the list of objects you can see on it, which besides animals are just common utensils you see in a household. There's the sun and the moon. You see swallows or flying fish. There's a lizard or a crocodile. There are 2 dhaus, which is a Burmese word for a cutting implement to clear the jungle. You have earthen cooking pots, birds, an axe, 2 spears, possibly a ladder. There's dishes for food and coconut water vessels, a palm tree, a canoe, 3 pigs. There's a shed for drying the coconut or pandanus, domestic fowl, a mariner's chest, a dog, fish of different kinds, and a turtle. Another piece of art I thought you might find interesting, but has a little more cultural significance than being a purely artistic piece of work, is this Henta board from the Nicobar Islands in the British Museum, collected by Colonel Mann in the late 1800s. It's also featured on the British Museum's collection on Google Arts and Culture, and I encourage you to go check those collections out. It's made of areca palm wood with incised figures, including at the top is a figure you see holding an umbrella with the sort of chronometer and compass on either side. It's painted in red and black. It's apparently quite large, with at 5 feet 6 inches high and 4 feet 7 inch wide. As in other parts of the Indian Ocean, many people in the Nicobar Islands today practice Christianity or Islam while maintaining many traditional rites, including elaborate ceremonies carried out to avert or prevent or overcome misfortune. So such boards, as the one you can see on the right, were made in times of sickness, and the engraved and painted details help the ritual specialist to find the spirits which are causing grievance. The boats, for example, allowed him to travel along the coast to other islands and would serve to enlist the help of good spirits like the fish, animals, and creatures like mermaids. If the ritual was successful, then this would be hung outside the house to ensure the good health of the ailing person. And the Henta koi was invoked every new moon to retain its healing effect, or in some cases, its ability to ward off malevolent spirits. Details on this board also provide us with information about life on the islands, which is very important because from this period, we can see the importance of maritime trade in the Indian Ocean in the different boats, which is they serve as a reminder of the vibrant trading world of the Indian Ocean and the Nicobar Islands. And the houses depicted show the traditional beehive architecture. And the economic life of the islanders in the 19th century, which relied on horticulture, animal husbandry, fishing, and some hunting, are all illustrated here in different ways. I'd like to acknowledge and take just a moment to express my gratitude to the people of the Nicobar Islands who have traveled immensely for their time, patience, and generosity through my research. My fieldwork was supported by the Ambedkar University Delhi Learning Enhancement Fund, and the staff in many archives and libraries were extremely helpful, principally the National Archives of India, the Archives of the Andaman and Nicobar Administration in Port Blair. And I'd like to thank you all so much for your time and for joining me in learning a little more about a very interesting group of islands, very far from here. But I hope at some point you would all be able to go and visit. just like I look forward to visiting you in UPI.
Thank you, Shaina. That was wonderful. And so many things that I really had no idea about. This is incredible. And I hope that other people feel the same way. I'm wondering if anybody has any questions, if they would like to either take your camera off and or, put your camera on and turn on your microphone and you could ask a question. And here's one in the chat. So I will read it. Is there any record of exotic animal plant introduction by maritime traders and voyagers in any of the Nicobar Islands?
Thank you for your questions, Andan. And it's really nice to virtually see you. I know he works on the Nicobar. We've not been able to meet in person or on the islands, so it's really good to find you here. There's especially, I know the records from the British period were a little more accessible to me owing to language issues, but even the scholars who studied the Danish colonization speak to the introduction of cattle, for instance, and in terms of dairy farming in Terrace Island. And in the British period, there was the penal settlement created in Angkori, which undertook cultivation and many experiments with crops, introducing cotton and many species of fruits. Even the Moravian missionaries were trying their hand at cultivating. So there has been an introduction of different things which we then see figure in as produce that is traded in terms of the fruits and spices and other things that became significant traded items.
What a great question. Thank you. Anybody else have any comments or questions that they would like to either put in the chat or speak out loud? We'd love to have them. While you're thinking, I would like to ask a question, and that is, how did this, what's your motivation? How did you get involved in this kind of topic? Why did you choose it? And yeah, I'm just really curious. When students take on a PhD project, it has to be something you're passionate about because you have to live with it for a while. And I think you're passionate about it.
Oh, absolutely. And as a disclaimer, I did have a bit of experience being around the coast. My father was in the Indian Navy, but I've been landlocked for a better part of my life. And my master's research took me to the cold desert of Spiti in northern India. It's isolated and it's sort of like an island, I would feel, for a better part of the year. And that was the thread that I was following while I was thinking about doing my PhD. If it was a metaphorical island, and how do we look at a real physical island which has to contend with being connected and disconnected by seas for vast periods of time, and what does that do to the relationship of the people and their environment? And those also became, as islands are, like laboratories, experiments to understand so much about social and environmental interaction. But we tried to do something different, and under the immense guidance of my supervisor, who's an ecologist who's worked on the Nicobar Islands, this became a natural choice as a study area. And I'm so grateful for that.
It's wonderful when you can have those getting to do the research in these wonderful places and really care about it, and what you're contributing to the discipline is incredible because it's so new. There's a lovely question here from Ashika. Saying, so lovely to, and you probably know this person because she says, hear and see you again. Was wondering a bit about the ethnographic work that you did through your field work. I was wondering that too, and about putting some of those stories out there. So much of our knowledge is from the colonial times and archives. Do you think it's possible now to overwrite or retell some of these narratives through Indigenous voices now? Great question.
Absolutely, and it was a challenge to reclaim some Indigenous voices through the archives. It's still something I'm interested in doing, but I understand that we can, if not reflect back to a period so far in history, there are techniques to engage Indigenous experiences and stories. I know Manish Chandi, who Ishika is familiar with, has done some work on understanding the oral histories of the Nicobarese people and kind of revisiting the folk tales that have been written of the people by colonial administrators. And for the present, yes, that's just another section of my thesis. Maybe I'll get another time to speak about it at UPEI. But from that part of the fieldwork, yes, Ishika, I did a lot of observation in terms of what relationships are, because it's also, it's an interesting side note, Laurie, since I mentioned the different demographics you see, in the Nicobar Islands is a substantial population of people who now migrated here over 60 years ago, I think, and they have developed a unique relationship to the islands and to the plantations. And the Nicobars have another way. And Ishika's actually research was Pylon the macaque that are featured there eating the pandanus fruit, also spoke to these settler communities. And I think instead of seeing the tension, we are now seeing how different communities have engaged. And I would actually prefer not to be the one giving the voice, to have actually someone from the community speak to their understanding of it. I know there was an anthropologist from the Nicobarese community who wrote the first primer about the islands, which also kind of opened up this box, because when we say Nicobarese, it's also an artifact. There's so many distinct communities and linguistic groups which are just used in this catch-all colonial category. I hope I answered your question in some way, Ishika.
Beautiful. Here's another one. It is from Monica. I really enjoyed your talk. Yes. Could you comment on how well some of these practices are being preserved, and are they being practiced by the younger generation as they were, or have they undergone any changes? Great.
Thank you for that. And actually that helps me clarify what I was trying to say to Ishika. So one of the points I did want to, because this was supposed to be a context for my present day fieldwork, but it ended up becoming a passion project. And I'm finding out more about the history, which upends my own understanding of the islands. That if you just move back a little further, you see that these are a very cosmopolitan and vibrant trading culture, and not as insular as we imagine, because presently the Nicobar Islands, after independence, are deemed a tribal reserve, and there is no foreign trade permitted, or even our access to the island as researchers has to be mediated through permits and systems. So that kind of was interesting to see. There's really a shift in these few centuries from being the vanguard of like foreign trade as in the Indian subcontinent to the complete opposite. So there was a lot of cultural mix at any point of time. And there is some now. It was very interesting. If Monica's familiar with this movie, I was just doing my field work, and I would just hear snatches of sayings from the movie or a dialogue or a song, which I did not think would belong here. So it's intermingling. It's this beautiful fluidity for the younger generation, and a way of like mixing as youngsters are across the world. So I wouldn't think, I was trying to make a point that I wouldn't think it's necessarily a bad thing, so long as it's on the terms of the people and they have the opportunity to exercise autonomy and choice.
Yes.
But the changes we do see mostly, I think, respond to the effects of the tsunami, the immense loss of life and the fracturing of the social structures of the traditional king groups. And also how they will navigate now with aspirations, with increasing education and children wanting to explore different avenues. And as I said before, some of these activities are very, they rely on these reciprocal relations of exchange, extended kin groups. So that, I imagine, would be a challenge.
I know that within Island Studies, there's been lots of talk about how we do research and looking at various ways of different methodologies that involve co-creation of knowledge with our partners, and making sure that their voices are as front and center. And so I think that's just such a fantastic thing to be aware of, and thinking about these stories and how they can get out there. Dr. Jean Mitchell, who is our UNESCO chair in Island Studies and Sustainability, has done a lot of work in Vanuatu and working with youth there, and she uses video and gets them telling their own stories missionaries, and she teaches them how to use, or she gets training for them so that they can use the cameras and edit and stuff. And so you have all of these wonderful stories coming out from the youth, and it's been just a lovely project for her to be helping out with, to facilitate as best she can. So yeah. One of the things that I was wondering about was the archipelagraphy of the islands and all of the routes that they took, and wondering if, there must have been some power dynamics. So you said one of the islands was the center, was the hub. Have those kept going? Are they similar now, all these couple centuries later, the power dynamics?
Oh no,
islands?
and it just feels like I keep pulling a thread and there's just so much keeps coming out. So which is another paper we have to write on, is about this, the Nancowry being this hub, and then that moves in the British colonial period north to Nicobar, because that becomes their administrative center, which is a legacy that persists to the present. So post-independence, a lot of the administrative structures have colonial origins. So even the way the administration is structured today, Nicobar becomes the center of the district, and it's the northernmost frontier. And at some point, we believe the southernmost island may have been more involved in because of its proximity to Indonesia, more involved in trade. So we're trying to still process this idea to see how these hubs have kind of shifted, which respond to trade, but at some point it ceases to be trade and becomes just geopolitical ambition and power, which moves these hubs north. And now it's actually further north to outside the group. So Port Blair becomes the center of the entire group, whereas historically you don't see it figure on the trade map, Laurie. Because the Andaman people were not, the people of the Andamans were not involved in maritime trade in the same way the Nicobaris were.
Okay, yeah. Must have been fun working with all those old maps too. They're always so beautiful, yeah. Monica asked the question, were you talking about the movie Samsara?
I haven't, and it is on my watch list. I believe it's a collection of beautiful images that.
Okay, I don't know.
Oh no, the movie I was talking of, though, if you're talking of the movie dialogue, that was Bahubali.
Well, this was amazing. Thank you for this. Unless anybody else has any last comments or questions, I'm just absolutely thrilled to have had you here and to learn a little bit about this little part of the world. I know that with Jean's work as UNESCO chair now, she really wants to start engaging more with the she's always been, her focus has been the Pacific Islands, but to start engaging more with the Indian Ocean and the islands within the Indian Ocean, and then seeing some of the similarities and differences, I think is going to be a really neat way of looking at island studies and archipelagos, and a great addition to island studies. So we're really happy to know that you're doing the work that you're doing, and hope to bring you into some of it. I know she has some aspirations to host some workshops in these places, and wouldn't that be fantastic if we get to, do a little field trip or something to the Nicobar Islands? I'd sign up in a minute. You can be our guide. No. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody so much for coming. Oh, here's a question. Sayantan you mentioned Makakwe, is that how I pronounce it, being accepted as a barter. Has there been any record of Nicobaris moving Makakwes between islands? Thank you.
I think so. And I do remember, so this is the first voyage of the English East India Company. And I believe Lancaster also engaged in barter with macaques, but I will have to check. Because as of now, they're a protected species, and trade in them is a strict no-no.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, at this point in our lectures, when our speaker is finished and we're saying thank you and everything, we always have a gift for our speaker, and generally it's a book. It's published by Island Studies Press, and it comes in a potato bag, because Prince Edward Island, as well as being famous for Anne of Green Gables, is also famous for its potatoes. And so the book that I chose is, I don't know, unless you have it, we have lots of other ones. This is Jim Randall's An Introduction to Island Studies, and it's a really good overview of the kinds of things that we talk about in island studies. And so I'm going to get your email or your mailing address, and I will send you a copy complete with the potato bag as a thank you. So I will now pass it over to Megan, who's going to thank you. And I am really happy to have made this connection with you. And I look forward to lots more. And let's get you to Prince Edward Island. Okay. All right. Megan.
Thanks, Laurie. Thank you, Shaina, for your fascinating lecture. I feel like I learned so much. I hope that someday we'll be able to have you here on PEI. Love to meet you. And thank you to everyone that chose to join us today in the audience. If you would like to be the first to know about future lectures in our island series or other island news, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter at islandstudies.com/newsletters. And keep an eye out for the confirmation email that you will receive afterwards. I'm linking it in the chat as well, so that if you want to, you can just click there. I hope you all had a great time. Have a lovely day.